Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Amcrott. I'm the Executive Director of the Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program here at Case Western Reserve University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our 2019 Northeast Ohio Public Policy Series. Tonight's program is titled, How Can We Reduce Gun Violence in Cleveland? And we are coming to you from the Timmons-Mitchell University Center here on the campus of Case Western Reserve. Before we begin, I want to recognize and thank a few organizations who are especially instrumental in making this year's public policy series possible. Our program partners are the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University, the League of Women Voters, Cleveland.com, Cuyahoga County Public Library, Cleveland Heights University Heights Public Library, and Lakewood Public Library. Tonight's session is also sponsored by the Begun Center for Violence Prevention, Research, and Education at Case Western Reserve University, and we are grateful to our corporate sponsor, First Interstate Properties Limited, for supporting this series. I want to remind everyone as well about our upcoming public policy session next week with Dr. John Grabowski here at the Timmons-Mitchell University Center, which will be focused on the Immigration Acts of 1921 and 1924 and how they changed Cleveland forever. We do ask everyone to be respectful to our panelists. Our intention here is to have a presentation and conversation amongst our panelists. We do have opportunities for Q&A. Everyone has the opportunity, if you haven't grabbed one, to get a note card and pencil. Put your questions on the note cards. They will be collected and brought up to our moderator, who will screen the cards and pose questions to our panelists. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Peter Krouse. Peter is public interest and advocacy reporter with Cleveland.com. Prior to that, he was editorial writer and member of the Northeast Ohio Media Group Plain Dealer editorial board. Altogether, Peter has been with Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer for over 18 years, and we are grateful and thankful to him for moderating our session this evening on a most important topic. Peter Krouse, thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, well, good evening, and thank you for attending tonight's public forum on how to reduce gun violence in Cleveland and in Ohio and anywhere for that matter. I'm sure what we're going to learn tonight has applicability just about anywhere. Just as a way of background, this is the third forum on gun violence that the League and the various partners have sponsored over the past several months. The first forum featured advocates for gun control with a lot of emphasis on how to get your voice heard in Columbus. The second forum included actual legislators discussing Ohio's gun laws and why Ohio has some of the loosest gun laws in the country. Tonight is different. Tonight, we're going to take a non-political look. We'll get a non-political perspective on how to reduce gun violence that doesn't require convincing a downstate conservative legislator that it makes sense maybe to limit assault weapons or pass some red flag laws. What we'll discuss tonight are ways that individuals, healthcare providers, judges, police officers, community groups, anybody, what they can do right now to try and stop people from shooting each other, and as we'll learn tonight, in many cases, themselves. We'll discuss such things as intervention, keeping guns away from children, and recognizing when individuals are experiencing emotions that generate concern over whether or not they should be possessing a gun, things of that nature. We will also be taking questions, so hand them up, and I'll try to ask them as we move along, assuming they haven't already been answered during the discussion. So let me introduce the panelists. Starting at the far end is Jane Timmons-Mitchell. She is a PhD senior research associate at the Begun Center for Violence Prevention, Research, and Education here at Case. At the Social Work School, the Jack Joseph and Marion Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. She's also a clinical child psychologist with 35 years experience, and she's also a member of the advisory board of the Ohio Coalition Against Gun Violence. And she writes a blog, right? Children Will Listen, for Psychology Today. And then next to Dr. Timmons-Mitchell is Judge Joan Synenberg. Judge Synenberg has been a common pleas judge since 2007. Briefly before that, she was a Cleveland Municipal Court judge. Before that, she was a defense attorney for many years. And before that, she was a social worker. And we're going to hear about some of the work she does still in the county jail later tonight. And next to Judge Synenberg, we have Dr. Lolly McDavid. She's medical director of child advocacy and protection at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital, responsible for community outreach and programming, as well as coordinating the medical services for the Child Protection Unit, serving at-risk children and families in Northeast Ohio. And then next to Dr. McDavid is Andy González, former Cleveland commander of the Cleveland Police Force. He's now chief of the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority, which has some 60 units, or 60 developments, 10,000 units, some 55,000 people living there. And so these are our panelists. And let me begin tonight with one question, and I want you all just to just answer this real briefly, like one sentence, okay? Because I just and then we'll get into the details, and we'll start, Andy, here with you. Are problems with gun violence getting better or worse?
Worse.
Worse. Okay, Dr. McDavid. Worse. Judge.
Worse.
Judge.
Worse.
Dr. Worse. Okay. All right, there you have it. So we're going to learn something tonight, hopefully to make it better. To begin, what I'd like to do is ask Chief González to maybe give us a little bit of a lay of the land. And what I'd like to know in particular is what kind of guns do we have on the streets and in the homes of Cleveland?
Well, good evening, everybody. In regards to what kind of guns, we're seeing a wide range, ranging from a regular revolver, which is the typical, what we used to call six-shot, all the way to assault-type rifles out in the streets. The most prevalent firearm that we are encountering and confiscating is the 9mm. From different makes and models, but primarily 9mm, I would say by far is the most popular firearm out in the streets. In regards to what's in people's homes, I don't really know. I can't really tell. Unfortunately, we are on the back end of what's inside somebody's home because of a burglary, a break-in, or someone from inside the home has availed themselves of that firearm, which in turn then goes out into the streets. So, and that's how we are able to decipher or work backwards as to what firearms are in someone's home, only if it appears out in the street, and if it appears that we have a suspect involved with it, and that the firearm has been involved in some kind of trauma or criminal event.
Mm-hmm. And if well, what percentage of guns would you say are possessed illegally?
Peter, I don't know what percentage are possessed illegally. I would say that in law enforcement, we encounter a very high volume of firearms that are not registered, that we can't track a previous owner to, or have been obtained by means of a crime. And what I mean by that is, as I mentioned before, it's a home that has been burglarized and a firearm or firearms have been taken outside the home, or in some cases, individuals that are keeping the firearm in a vehicle, and then that vehicle is stolen And then, of course, the firearm is taken as a result of that. But in regards to a percentage, I really can't put a percentage on that.
Okay. And if any of the others panelists want to feel like they can weigh in on this, Judge, you may have some experience with this directly, in your day-to-day activities, but how does somebody get access to a gun? What makes a young person, or any person for that matter, willing to use a lethal weapon, to commit a crime or protect themselves or whatever?
Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to be here, especially with these panelists, and I appreciate this, Peter. So why people have guns, we typically hear in the courthouse every single time I ask, which is any case that there is involving a gun, why'd you have a gun? And the answer I get is the same every time, which is protection for themselves or for a loved one. And we've learned a lot. In my vantage point, I listen to human drama all day long. I see it. And I'm an optimist, I have to tell you this. And it pains me to say that something's getting worse because we're striving to make the situation better. But people use guns in crimes, if that's the specific question that you're asking, for a number of reasons. First of all, listening to young people in the jail, which I'll share with you some points of this evening. It's a matter of respect. A perception on the street is that if you have a gun, you'll be respected. Also, the young people that we see that have these guns, and 9mm, I agree with the chief, are very popular. But again, I see what comes from my vantage point, which is a case in the courthouse. But people use guns because they're effective. If they see something that they want, whether it's on social media or in the street or something that someone has and they want it, these kids will tell me they'll go get it. And without to go too far ahead, I'm basing what I'm sharing with you on what I've dubbed the listening tour. Sitting in the jail over the last couple of years, sometimes joined by people like Charles C., who's with us this evening, formerly of Community Reentry, Sharina Cloud from Cleveland Peacemakers Alliance, and others, and just listen to several hundred people. And the perspectives that I share with you this evening, I share with you on behalf of the kids and the young men and women who've shared those thoughts with me. But it's to protect themselves and their loved ones. And I don't want to take too much time right now, but there's a very, very strong sense, ironic as it sounds, that not having a gun is dangerous. And you'd rather not have a gun, you'd rather have a gun and not need it than need one and not have one. So this is, generally speaking, a lot of what we hear. But as the evening goes, and I hope to share more with you, I do think that as hopeless as it seems and as depersonalized as our community seems to have become for a variety of reasons, that there is hope out there and that there's something each and every one of us can do from a perspective of humanity and also something that might look more concrete.
And by way of information, what is a 9mm? It's a 9mm. It's a small handgun, is that right?
Chief? I mean, it's big enough.
Well, it's not necessarily a small handgun. The reason, just a quick education, I guess, it's considered a caliber of the firearm, and the 9mm references the diameter, the size of the diameter of the actual casing that contains the bullet, which of course fires. By comparison, the 9mm is very close to a .38 caliber revolver or .38 caliber round. They're very, very close inside. Of course, then the calibers increase from there. We've all heard of the 44 calibers and the 45 calibers. So the larger the number, the larger the bullet that is in the firearm. But by far the most common one is the 9mm, perhaps because the 9mm round is the most popular able to get. Is the ammunition that is the most popular out on the streets. Well, and in stores also, in legal gun stores, the most popular round that they carry would be the 9mm.
But it's not a rifle, right?
It's not a rifle.
It's not a rifle,
no.
Yeah, okay.
And you're not limited to 6 bullets. You can put a clip and then have 15.
Does that make it a semi-automatic weapon? or
Yeah,
no?
what makes it, a revolver, of course, requires an individual, I hate to talk about this in
We'll
a
get
gun
off of this. Just,
but-
we just
but,
want to get a little lay of the land
A
here.
revolver requires an individual to continue to pull the trigger every time and then the cylinder
Yeah.
turns. A semi-automatic is similar, except that when you pull the trigger actually remains backwards. So it's a lot easier to continue pulling the trigger versus a revolver. And then to Dr. McDavid's point, the 9mm or semi-automatics are capable of high-capacity magazines, or commonly called clips. So the average magazine for a 9mm would be anywhere between 12 to 15 rounds. And then you can get adapters for that, magazines that will carry on up to, or in some cases, 45, 50 rounds. And then with switching those, if you've got multiple magazines, you could imagine the firepower that is there.
And okay, and one last question to try to get a lay of the land. How are most young people shot today? Is it intentionally? Is it by accident? And are there things in common about the life experiences of young people who end up either the victims of gun violence or the perpetrators of gun violence? Are there some commonalities here? Who would like to go ahead?
So just, is this on? Okay. So just to speak to some background statistics, so I was reviewing to make sure I was current. The CDC has said that in the last year for which statistics are available, which was like the year before last, that gun deaths across the board were declining, but that suicide deaths are increasing. And it turns out, as we all know, I think that about 2/3 of the gun deaths in this country each year are suicides. So I'm the suicide prevention expert because I do the evaluation for the Ohio State Suicide Prevention Grant and also a bunch of other work clinically. So I think it's really important to make a distinction, because if you're talking about, why do young people die by guns, a whole big propensity of it is that they kill themselves using guns. And there are known ways to decrease that event from happening, but it mostly, to cut to the chase, has to do with separating the young person from access to the gun to begin with. And that's where I would like to focus, is to talk about prevention, because it's the separation rather than the getting closer to the guns and what they do that I think is really the answer to how we prevent
How do you
gun
separate?
violence.
How do you separate the guns from the?
Well,
from the kids?
in lots of ways, but I mean, the biggest way for kids is you prevent access, but also for other people as much as is possible legally. We know that, for example, people who die by suicide, which is the correct way of saying it, not commit suicide. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is very big on this, so we can all retrain our ways of saying this, right? But so most people who die by suicide die because they have access, and the access comes at the point of some impulse that can't be restrained. And there is pretty good research that talks about how if you separate the impulse from the gun for a very short period of time, sometimes 20 to 30 minutes, that you can in fact prevent the suicide, at least in that moment. And then the other thing, I'll stop in a second, but the other thing that people often do say about suicide, which is also incorrect, is that, well, if somebody is going to die by suicide and you prevent them from having a gun, they're going to do it some other way, and that is simply not true. 90% of the time, somebody who is prevented from completing a suicide attempt does not go on to die by suicide. So.
Just to follow up on that, would so-called red flag laws have helped? Not we won't get into that, but absent something like that, what can be done by family members, friends, associates, coworkers? Are there ways to step in and try and prevent something from happening? Are there clues to look for?
I mean, I don't know if anybody else wants to, but I can.
Go ahead.
So a background of depression is often noted in people who eventually die by suicide, but not always. And especially in younger people, As you may know, depression is not always a hallmark of what we think of as depression in adults, right? Depression in young people can look like anger. And so that, putting those two things together. Again, though, the red flag laws, so these are variously reviewed. Some people say that is the thing to do. The most recent best review I saw, and it said that it's not established yet. But what I think is probably a good practice is the CALM training that is available from Dartmouth. This is counseling against lethal means, which is something that all mental health and behavioral health workers can be trained in, and also all medical people. And it's to help spot, the signs, and then in the case of somebody who seems to meet those criteria, to really up the ante in terms of separating the person from the availability of the gun. So it can be as simple as like putting the gun someplace else, with a relative, or disabling the gun, or putting it in a gun safe, or any of those things, but some kind of very tangible way of separating the person from the means.
Okay, all right. Dr. McDavid, let me ask you a question about some of the things that you're involved with, and it has to do with intervening in gang violence or intervening in situations to prevent gun violence from escalating. This is something you do at UH, correct?
Yeah, it's interesting because, when I was training years ago, pediatric surgeons weren't really trained in gunshot wounds. And I remember when there was a Mount Sinai hospital, the military used to actually send their surgeons through places like Mount Sinai and big city urban centers, because that's how you learned how to deal with high velocity gunshot wounds. And so you needed to know how to do it when you were in the field, when you were in the military. And so they learned to do it in cities. I actually come from I'm going to digress a little bit. I come from a military family. And I also come from a family. I grew up in southwestern Ohio, so I know about those people that don't want you to take their guns away. I went to high school with them. And I grew up in a house where there were guns. My father and my brothers hunted. And their guns were it was in a gun rack, and it was locked. And I didn't know until my father died that he had a handgun. That was like in a dresser drawer, and I didn't know about it. I didn't go in his dresser drawers. So I grew up with people and actually where I grew up, the first day of hunting season was an excused absence from high school if you could show that you had a license. Still that way? Oh, well, I don't know where it is in Ohio now, but that's the way it was when I was in high school. So I was not, but guns were not a fascination. My son is a graduate of the Naval Academy, and he taught weaponry. And he likes to say that in homes where there's a handgun, there's a 66% chance the gun will be used against somebody who lives in the house because somebody goes for the gun. And so while we're all worried about being out on the street, it's very unsafe to have one in your house. We asked in our part of our medical record, our electronic medical record, we asked about guns. And I don't know if you know, but about 2 years ago in Florida, people came out, they were going to take doctors' licenses away if you asked about guns in the house, okay? So we said, well, we'll be ready for them in Ohio, but it hasn't been a problem. I'm always very interested when I ask the question what I hear. There are a number of parents who will say to me, yes, I have a gun. And then we talk about where is the gun and how is it safe? Do you have a gun lock? Do you have a gun safe? I had 2 little guys one time, and they were brought in by their grandmother. And I said to her, do you have a gun? She said, yeah, but they don't know where it is. And I said, where's Grandma keep her gun? And they said, in the second drawer of her bureau. Because they've gone through everything. And we've had kids who've been accidentally shot where the gun was between the mattress and the box spring, and nobody thought that the child knew where it was. I think another myth is that kids can't fire guns. Little kids can't. It only takes 7 pounds of pressure to pull the trigger on a 38. So it's not that hard to shoot a gun. And you don't necessarily have to be a good shot to hurt somebody. So when I said the fact that, my son taught weaponry, the joke in my family is that in a house where there's a handgun, there's a 66% chance the gun will be used against somebody in the house. And my son says, and if Mom had one, it would be a 75% chance. So I don't have a gun. Although I have to tell you, years ago when I worked at Metro, because I remember I'm a country girl. When I worked at Metro and I was coming home late at night, this was over 30 years ago, and my brother said it was probably a BB gun, but somebody shot something at my car and it did quarter panel damage. So I got home and I checked it out. So I told my brother, I said, I'm going to take the lessons and I'm going to get a permit to carry. And, I'm going to do it legally, but I want to, if I'm coming up Woodland at, 10:30 at night, I'll feel more safe with a gun. Remember, my family's all military. My brother said, are you willing to live with the fact that you killed somebody? And I said, well, I don't want to kill anybody. He said, no, when you pull out your weapon, you shoot to kill. He said, women get in trouble because they pull out a gun and they say, I've got a gun. And the bad guy either takes your gun and shoots you with it, or now your gun is on the street. So I agree that people think that it's making them safer than it is. But I want to read to you a little bit about where we are right now at Rainbow. So from January 1st, 2016 through December 31st, 2017, Rainbow provided care for 191 children and adolescents aged 15 and under for gunshot wounds and assaults. 66 of these patients were gunshot wounds and 125 were victims of assault. Our medical records show that a 29% victim recidivism rate of our patients seen in 2017 for gunshot wounds. So almost 1 out of every 3 kids that we saw came back in later with another gunshot wound. And 2 months ago, I sit on the Child Death Review Committee for the county, and we reviewed a case of a young man who had been in our emergency room before and then came in basically with brain matter in his oral pharynx because his head had been broken open. So I have to, I'm a pediatrician. I'm supposed to take care of nice, healthy little babies, but this is the reality of what we deal with. If you don't know, there is something called the Cuyahoga County Child Fatality Report, and it's called Protecting Our Children. And we do it every year. There's a group of us that sit on the Child Death Review. And Cuyahoga County's review is actually considered a model for the country. I've presented it to other things from the Academy of Pediatrics because they want to see how we do. And if you go online, you can get it. But we do intentional injury deaths, unintentional injury deaths, intentional injury deaths, unintentional things like drownings. And what we found was in 2017, which are our most recent numbers, because if you think about it, we just closed out 18, so now we've got to analyze those numbers. So the most current numbers we have are 2017. And homicide was the 3rd leading cause of child death in 2017. And the highest number of homicides and suicides in the last 10 years. So if you want to go online, you can find that. It'll show you total firearms deaths. So I think that I see kids who feel that they need a gun to protect themselves because they think everybody else has a gun and everybody else doesn't have a gun. We have family members who may not take care of guns in the way they should be taken care of. But I do have a lot of parents who are open to, let's talk about how you store a gun. Because they're not going to give up the gun. So let's talk about trigger locks and let's talk about gun safes. And what do you do? I have one mom in my practice and she works for Brinks. So she's allowed to bring home her sidearm. I call them sidearms. Her sidearm. And when her son got to be a little older, I said, do you have to bring it home? Because it's too intriguing to him. And so she said she could leave it in her locker at work. So we talked about it, and she leaves it in her locker at work. It's perfectly acceptable. I don't think that police are allowed to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have to wear theirs. So I think we have to make people aware. I think we have to talk about things that we can do to keep children safe from guns, because you think it is in your drawer, nobody knows. And then people do stupid things like, my mother-in-law, God rest her soul, she was a wonderful church-going lady. But one year we were going out for New Year's, and so I told my kids, I said, Dad and I are going out, so you all are going to spend the night at Granny's. And they go, oh, great, because she goes out on her porch and she shoots her gun at midnight. Number one, I didn't know she had a handgun, okay? So I said, Lil, you can't shoot your gun. She says, oh, I just fired up in the air. But that bullet comes down someplace. So all those people who think at midnight when they shoot it up in the air and it just goes to Mars or whatever, that's not where it goes. It comes down somewhere. So I think we have to do a lot more on teaching people about responsibilities with guns. I can tell you that the men in my family, the military people, they take guns really seriously. I mean, it's not a joke, it's not a fun thing. It is what they were trained to do, and they take it very seriously. So I think we have to have those conversations with families. But I also think that a lot of people have guns because they really do believe that it makes them safer. When I moved to the house I live in, I told my dad I was going to put in a security system because my husband had to travel. He said, "Don't do that, I'm bringing you something." He brought me a pump-action shotgun. And he said, when they hear click, click, and they keep coming, they deserve what they get. I said, "Daddy, put it in the car and take it on back home to Greene County. We'll get the security system." So there's a lot going on, and I'm glad to see all of you here because obviously this is a very important subject. I think we have to have a community strategy. So we have gotten a grant at University Hospitals at Rainbow, and it's called the Anti-Fragility Project. And I know that doesn't make any sense to anything, but anti-fragility, when they make steel, they make little breaks in it so that if it gets bent, it will bend and it won't break. So we are trying to make those places so that children can heal back again. And if we have time, I'll tell you about what we're going to do. But it's going to be a full-on press to try to change the families that they come from. Because a lot of these kids, especially kids who are in gangs, that's their family. I mean, I see so many kids who they don't sit down to eat with their family. They're what my mother-in-law would call unchurched. They have no community. We see kids who may go to 4 different schools in a year and keep moving and not succeeding. And so we've got to look at the things that are keeping children from succeeding and wanting to do the things that they do that put themselves in harm's way.
So how do you break that cycle? How do you reach a kid who wants to have a gun for protection, or maybe a kid who wants to have a gun because they're part of a gang and it's going to help go after some rivals or whatever? How do you go to a kid like that or a young man and say, put down your gun?
Well, we're not going to patch them up and send them back out like we used to. So we're going to have intentional services right at the bedside. We're going to have 24-hour social workers in our emergency room. We're going to connect with the family. We're going to see what kinds of educational supports they need, what kind of community supports they need. We are missing a lot of things. We have a lot of people in this community who really are trying to work for children, and I see some of them in this room. But there are a lot of things missing. I live in Shaker Heights. If there are parents who will not let their children in the house until they get home from work. I came home every day. Both of my parents worked. I let myself in. I changed my clothes. I made a snack, and I did my homework. And I didn't go out, and nobody came in. But we have kids whose parents say, "You can't come in the house until I get home." So they're on the street. Mm-hmm. And there are no places. Shaker is certainly not set up with 24-hour rec centers and places for kids to go. And so they end up going to the library. And, you get 3 teenagers in the library and they start acting goofy. So then they get put out. And so we really have to look at kids. Where are they and where do we need to be for them? We need more rec centers. We need more boys and girls clubs. We need families to basically take kids in. I mean, when my daughter was in the 3rd grade, I packed a lunch for somebody in her class every day because I found out that she did not have a lunch. And so we worked it out, and I'd pack the lunch, and then the first time I said to my daughter, I said, "Now you've got to find a way to hand her lunch without everybody seeing her do it." We put it in a paper bag. And so like the end of the week, I said, so how's it going? She goes, "Mom, she meets my bus now." She meets the bus to get the lunch. So about 2 weeks into it, she says, "Mom, so-and-so said, can you make her peanut butter sandwich with strawberry jelly instead of grape jelly because she doesn't like grape jelly?"
That's something.
And at first I thought, well, grape jelly is cheaper than strawberry jelly. That's why we eat it. And then I decided, you know what? When you're in the 3rd grade, you should be important enough to somebody that they make your peanut butter sandwich the way you want it. So I did that, and that young lady finished high school and went on to college, and that may have been the little chink that she needed just to keep her going.
So it's a lot about just caring for people. Judge, you are in a situation where you see people coming to you all the time. Sometimes they change, right? Sometimes they don't. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned as a judge, but also tell us about this listening tour that you do, where you go into the Cuyahoga County Jail on a fairly regular basis. What made you start doing that, and what are you learning from that, and what things are you learning that might address this situation?
I have to say that I was startled to hear some of the numbers that I heard. I did not know that 2/3 of gun deaths in the country are from suicide. And these numbers are just kind of eye-opening to me. So I have learned so much on the bench, and it's been a blessing. But my 16 years as a criminal defense attorney was a great opportunity for me to learn about working with people who were in tremendous need. I also preside over what's called recovery court. It's a dual diagnosis specialized docket in common pleas. What we do is we help people who are diagnosed with addiction disorder and trauma. And when I listen to what we're hearing about put away your guns, that's what we're always telling people about their drugs. You know, put away your drugs so that your kids and grandkids aren't pilfering your neighbors or whatever, because we view that as another deadly type of weapon. So what I have seen as a Cleveland resident and as a judge on the bench for these years is that gun violence in our neighborhood seems to be more profound now. I listened to Dr. McDavid talking about trauma with babies and gunshots. When you see this on the news where a kid's caught in the crossfire, it's just heartbreaking. We do see each other, the chief and I, and Mr. C, and Shireen and others on a bi-monthly meeting at the U.S. Attorney's Office called STANCE, Standing Together Against Neighborhood Crime Every Day. And during these meetings, as we lament what's happening in our community, we thought it would be helpful to listen to people who are in the thick of it. And not every person that is in a hospital might be involved in gun violence, but as I have been in the jail listening to people, I will tell you that just about every single person in the jail who I've sat down and listened to has a gun, or will get a gun, or did have a gun, or has been shot, or lost a loved one in gun violence. So that says a lot about who's in jail, by the way. And I will tell you that our county population is certainly not 100% African American, but I have been in pods in Cuyahoga County Jail that are 99 or 100% African American. So that speaks to a system that is somehow flawed. I'm part of that, so I'll take responsibility where I must, but how can you not notice that? And so going into the jail seemed like a way to listen to people who are firsthand involved in what's going on there. So we go into the jail, we talk about very briefly what we would like, and that's for the ladies and gentlemen who are there to just share with us, tell us what they perceive the problems on the street to be, why we are experiencing gun violence, and just to share with you a little bit about that. And again, coming from them, kids have told me over and over that they are traumatized and that they need one-on-one counseling. And if I heard it once, I've heard it 100 times. We have all had trauma, and they've explained what it is. Many times it's exposure to violence or losing that loved one to a violent death, losing a parent early, losing a loved one. They talk about there's just too much killing going on. These kids, and I say kids, I use the term a little bit loosely because I'm talking about people in jail, but I think that if you're in your 20s, you're still kind of a kid, right? I don't know when the brain is fully developed, but Doctor, you could probably, thank you. So, I mean, these people that are adults in our court, no, but as we sit here right now, listening to these wonderful speakers say what they have to say, right now, just a very short drive from us, 7 minutes, there are thousands of people, 5 minutes in the juvenile detention center. In downtown, maybe 7 minutes. There's thousands of people locked up, completely bored, isolated, and extremely lonely. And what these kids tell me is that they just have a sense, and it is pervasive and it's obvious, of hopelessness, very low self-expectations. I've done informal polls because when somebody gets out, they've got to have a place to go, something to eat, someone to care for them and be able to care for their kids or their loved ones. And just by asking how many people don't have a place to go, it's about 20%. And I did not know that the homelessness was that rampant, and in the correctional system it is. And back to the point of humanity, I think the one thing that all of us can do, and you hear about this, looking out, packing a lunch, being there, being present for a person to feel that you care. I mean, I hear it in the courthouse. To your question, Pete, just today I had a kid on my recovery court docket who just overdosed last week because there's all these synthetics out there now that look like the real thing, and they're fentanyl, and this kid overdosed, almost died 5 days at Metro. And he said, "You've got nobody." He said, "I've got nobody. I don't have a family." I said, "Where are your family?" He said, "Really?" He said, "Are you going to invite me over for Thanksgiving dinner?" He said, "I know you care about me. I think that's wonderful, but what does that mean?" He said, "I don't have anybody." And I said, "Oh man, I'm thinking I'm going to rearrange Thanksgiving plans. My husband's here, so honey, we're gonna do it at our house this year, and I'm inviting some friends." But I'm listening to these kids and here just to share very common. This is a reduced list. No true healing. And these kids, I'm using somebody's got to get to our psychology, find out what's going on with us. Jail is hell because of the loneliness. I've been caged since, and then they tell me whatever age, but that's, they feel that. We don't have enough to eat. That was a common refrain, in jail and out. They're hungry and thirsty for attention. So there's smart, creative people that are telling me that they're hungry, and then they say for attention too. So very interesting. They feel invisible. They feel that there are not enough mentors. They believe that beefs are the root cause of a lot of the shootings out there, that you can have a beef that you know about, or you can have a beef that's not even your beef, it's somebody else's beef or your mother's beef. You could be on the wrong street at the wrong time. If you don't have a gun, you might be a known target. If you have something nice, you might be a known target. If you lose a fight and it's posted, you're a target. You're perceived to be weak.
What do you mean posted?
On social media.
Okay.
Young guys tell me that they follow older guys' examples, so they see the guy with the dope and the girls and the money and the gun, and they want a gun. They said having a gun is like having a Louis Vuitton belt. Okay. Fights at the detention center can lead to the street and vice versa, and guns. Now, I hear guns are cheap. They all say cheap, and they perceive cheap to be $200, $250. They can get them right away, and just about everybody has one. They intend to get one when they get out. Very, very concerned about protecting young women in the community from predatory males, including their mothers. They often talk about their mother's boyfriends. Single-parent household, another issue that was very, very common refrain. No safe passage to school. I want to go to school, and I can't get there safely, so I'm going to either steal a car or get a gun, because I want to go to school. And the reason I want to go to school is because at school, I can get a meal, and I don't want to mess that up. And at school, if we get into a fight, there shouldn't be any guns involved, and there will be adults that will break it up.
Judge, let me ask you just to follow up
Yeah.
on that real quick. Why can't a kid who wants to go get safely to school, why can't he get safely to school?
Well, there's a solution, right? And that's a solution that these kids are talking about. Why can't we have parents form some sort of safety councils?
Walking school buses.
And walk and talk programs where, we talk a lot about law enforcement, parents, families. It may mean that you are walking your kid to school and maybe another kid. Like you might not be packing them peanut butter and strawberry jam, but you might be walking that kid to school. And we owe that to each other. This is our problem. This is not somebody else's problem. This is our problem.
So one of the things if we're talking about a solution is I've been doing this for 38 years, and what comes across my desk is tragedy. And oftentimes it's tragedy associated with a gun. And when I say tragedy, I just don't mean a victim. I don't mean a person that was shot. I say tragedy in an individual that we've arrested as a result of committing an offense with a gun, because that too is a tragedy. So now that individual has to be prosecuted and dealt with in one way, and then we have to turn around, and we're very good at this. I mean, that's why we're law enforcement, and dealing with the victim in another way. So over the past years, I've dealt with this, and I've said, well, what can law enforcement What should we as cops be doing differently? There's that old saying, if you bang your head up against a brick wall, you're going to get the same results. So what I challenge our team, and I challenge my colleagues and my peers, is it's important to focus on guns, and it's important to focus on what guns do. But when we talk about gun violence, we're talking about two words, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the first word, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about the second word, which is violence. And when you deal with violence, as if you leave it strictly up to cops, we have failed miserably at addressing the issue of violence. Solution for us in regards to violence is lock them up. We have learned over the years that that is an awful, awful solution. It has not yielded any results. The truth is, if you're dealing with guns, you have to deal with the reasons why people are carrying guns, and at the premise, at the core of why an individual has a gun, in addition to access, is really about power. When a person has a gun, they feel powerful. When they feel powerful, they now are emboldened to do other things. But the reality is that they feel powerful because they don't want to feel like a victim. And when they don't want to feel like a victim, that clouds the individual's way of thinking in regards to conflict or conflict resolution. When we look at all violence, violence is a result of a person not able to mediate or resolve a conflict. I see these reports all the time. The reports start off, these two individuals got into an argument. One individual disrespected the other person. They started calling each other's names. When they called each other names, then they started more and more, it started getting worse and worse. And then the next thing you know, someone pulls out a gun and starts shooting. If we can focus on the violence aspect of it, I think that in looking at what causes the violence, what are the symptoms, what at the heart, at the root of what escalated to violence, I think as a community and a society, we'll be able to find a solution. And in turn, eventually, not right away, but eventually, we may be able to drive down, if not eliminate, gun violence.
And when you talk about violence, and what precipitates violence, in almost all these cases, these are individuals who, outside of being violent, they don't have a lot of hope. They don't have a lot of direction, right? They don't see a way forward. Is that right? I mean, think about it. When does a young person decide for the very first time, I'm going to pick up a gun? To me, to shoot a gun at somebody, to me, would just be an incredible experience, and I don't mean in an interesting way, but in an unbelievable way. And it's got to be that way to a certain extent with all kids at one degree or another, right? I mean, what is it that makes a kid say, you know what, yeah, I'm going to pick up that gun and I might even use it?
Well, I think it's become glorified. I think that there's a lack of oversight in the home. And when you look at the video games and you look at the movies and you look at what our young individuals or young kids are exposed to, there is a prevalence of a gun. In a video game, I don't know how many times a video game comes out and somebody's shooting somebody or there's a gun there. So my opinion, Gonzo, Andy González, not necessarily as chief, disclaimer there, is that we really got to do something with what our young kids are exposed to at a very early age. Mm-hmm. Because I think that that's learned. If the only way that a young person learns how to deal with conflict resolution is by escalating to violence or by brandishing a gun or by pointing a gun at each other and saying, stick them up, put them up, whatever it is. And I think eventually, if no one checks that, and if no one tells little Johnny or little Missy that that's wrong, that there are other ways to resolve conflict, that's what they're going to believe is the best way to do and handle that conflict as they grow older.
Jane, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, so to piggyback, the pathway, so this is just the research stuff, but it has real-world applications, I promise. The pathway for youth violence is very well established, has been in research for the last 40 years. And there are two main ways that you get to youth violence. One has to do through family and lack of supervision, and then that yields lack of associating with positive peers, so associating with deviant peers. So that's where you're going to find all the stuff that you all are talking about with your listening to her and the kids that are in the projects. And then the other part of it is it has to do with school. It has to do with lack of affiliation with school, and again, that may relate to the positive part of why the young man wants to go to school is that there are models, there's supervision, there are conflict resolution courses, there is school violence prevention. But what we know is that, different studies, there have been like 50 studies that have shown the same thing. And interestingly, the path for drug abuse is the same, with just a couple of variations. So, the modeling piece from video games and social media is probably in there, but it's not as powerful as these other things. And so we know this, and so knowing this, we also know how to interrupt it. I know that sounds lofty, but it's true. We really do know how to interrupt it, and there are programs that do that and do that effectively, that separate kids from the roots of the violence, and then they can do better.
Let's talk about those. What are some ways to interrupt violence that are working right now in this city?
Okay. So if you want, for people who like doing stuff on computer, looking for websites, Blueprints for Violence Prevention is a national project that's been going for a really long time. Dale Elliott out at the University of Colorado started it a long time ago, and there are known established best practices for decreasing youth violence. We have several of them in the city. The one that I know the best, because I did the most work with it, is multisystemic therapy. And there are lots of things that people say about that, mostly that it costs a lot of money. But you can see that with all the stuff that we're talking about, of course it's going to cost a lot of money. This is a holistic intervention that gets at all these levels. The thing that I wrote down while we all were talking, and I love the story about the peanut butter. That was so dear. And what occurs to me that we're dancing around, as we're talking about all the community resources, which are very important, of course, is the crucial thing is supporting parents when you've got them. Now, not everybody has them or can get to them. Rebuilding families, I know, is one of the hardest things that you can ever do, but it can be done. And I think coming up with a family that a kid can grow up in is probably the biggest effective prevention strategy. And we've seen it work, for decades now. These things really do
we do a very
work.
good job in Cuyahoga County of helping to rebuild families? Patch families back together?
I think we'd all have different perspectives on that. What I could say, because I guess my spin on it is sort of rarefied because, I'm kind of at the end of a pipeline where, if somebody's lucky enough to get there and they meet the criteria and they're, somebody who can be effectively served by the services, then yes. But does that work for everybody? Well, no, because of all the reasons that we've all said.
And obviously there's socioeconomic reasons for some of the stresses, obviously, that affect people and prompt them to conflict.
Well, it's interesting because, again, if you look back at all these 50 studies and the years of research, this is across socioeconomic level. This is across ethnicity. This is effective, period. And it can be done. It's just that what it takes to do it is tremendously difficult. It takes so much, and mostly what it takes is money. It takes intentionality, but mostly the other thing is money.
Money, like investing in things like
Paying for it.
Interrupters of some kind. Cleveland Peacemakers Alliance, right? Who can talk about that and the successes they've had? Judge?
Well, I appreciate that. I do sit on their board Sharina Cloud is here. Miriam is also here. And Cleveland Peacemakers has violence interrupters at Metro in residency. And by the way, we have Andrea here from Metro, and I know that we're not, just to digress for 1 second, just to show how they respond to a root problem. In their ER, when someone overdoses, they can see a recovery coach right then and there and get linked to services right then and there. They are stopping deaths that way. But violence interrupters are at UH and at Metro to respond to victims of shootings, and also to try to thwart when they hear that there's something going on out there. That's in addition to case managers, violence interrupters, and outreach workers. Thank you. But the case managers touch over 80 people a week through community referrals and just people that they learn about. But again, that's back to the connectivity, getting in between the gun, the person, anticipating when there could be a beef, having information on the street and the right people to handle it. But we talk about restoring families, and all of this is about families. And this is, you see what happens. Somebody gets shot, somebody gets killed. You get somebody who's the loss of that life, the person who's charged, the fallout to all their families. The ripple effect is very widespread. And everybody feels the hurt. It's just all bad. I mean, and we see that, and it's really, really hard to see. So anything that can be done to restore a relationship, to make people feel more connected to each other, it makes sense when you hear that what is depression was actually, it might look like anger in a kid. And we think about the frustration that these kids in jail feel. I asked them what advice they would give to a younger sibling, and they would say, trust no one, live every day like it's your last. It's just so dire and so bleak, but that's how they feel. So again, I'm dealing with, we're all in our own lanes here. I'm in a courthouse and I'm talking about listening to people in a jail, so their experiences come from their perspectives. But there's a lot of people right now that have those perspectives, and it's very difficult. And when we think about anything that any one of us could do, it's little things, not just big things. And I don't know if this is little or maybe it is a big thing. Name calling. Names hurt. Words hurt. And kids that have been called names forever, they feel that it just sooner or later they have the terrible feeling about themselves. And to build up somebody's self-worth when it's been beaten down forever, it's tough. I mean, kids are a product of what they see. And if you don't have dispute resolution through conversations, and I did ask that question, what about lay down your arms? And they're like, really? Seriously? No, that's pretty funny. What's your next one? No, we're not doing that.
Yeah, how do you convince...
talking is weak.
How do you convince somebody that there's no shame in putting down your gun, and I'm not going to say turning the other cheek, but in finding a different way? And as a follow-up to that, at what age, and any of you, please weigh in on this, at what age do we lose kids
Kids tell me...
to
excuse me.
a life of violence and a life of hopelessness?
They say as soon as they're old enough to be on the street, they are susceptible to violence.
Which is what age?
As soon as they're out there, they say that 8 and 9-year-olds have guns, sometimes from their mothers or their, an adult. They think these kids in jail tell me you need to get into the schools when kids are 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and talk to them. That a teenager or a young person, an adult, may not appreciate the dangerousness of a weapon. They don't. The chief has heard me say, a kid that was telling me, we all have guns, no big deal. Then I got shot. It really hurts. Being shot's a terrible thing. I couldn't believe it. It was so awful. But just appreciating the seriousness. And these kids will tell me, I don't appreciate the seriousness of it. I know it's risky. I know I could go to jail because of this. But I know the risks. I am taking the risks voluntarily. And there's a lot of justification, by the way. That which they decry, they perpetuate. So they'll say to me, guns are a problem out here. I'm carrying, well, who stops? When does it stop? When does somebody say, and I ask this all the time. I'm hopeful that there will be someone who's been through the system, or someone, a returning citizen that's going to say, I want to do this. I want to start a movement. Lay down your arms. Let's have a conversation. Because what are the disputes about? They can't even tell you. These are beefs. They don't even know what the beefs are about. And then we heard today someone at our stance meeting saying, you know, you go to a new school, you keep your head down, don't talk to anybody if you don't know them. What kind of world is this?
Are the schools, what can the schools do here?
Well, you know, there are a lot of things that I don't think we're doing correctly. Number one, the Juvenile Justice Center, the new one, when it was built, was to be a intervention center. It was not supposed to be what it's turned out to be. And we don't have a community will to say, let's put in the programs that we need. Some of these kids have vision problems. Some of them have learning problems. I mean, and you have to address them and get them to where they need to be before you send them back out. It shouldn't just be punishment. But I don't think that we believe in that. I think we believe if you're a bad kid, you're supposed to be punished. Now, I can tell you, sitting on the Child Death Review Committee, that kids who live in the outer ring suburbs get chance after chance after chance. The police give them a ride home. They don't take them downtown. And then eventually they do get killed because something happens, but it's not as often, and they get those chances. How many of us did stupid stuff when we were 12, 13, and 14, and we were lucky that we either grew up in a community or in a family where somebody caught us? And by caught us, I mean caught us like this, and we got a second chance. So these kids, a lot of these kids don't get second chances. And I see kids who are angry at 3 and 4. Last night I was in the hospital parking lot and parking garage, and this guy was parking. He had put the kids out of the van, and he's going to park. And they're like, and I said, hey, go over there and stand. I said, who are you with? Well, my uncle's driving out, so go stand by the elevator until your uncle has parked the van. And this one boy, he may have been 10, he wasn't going. I said, did you hear what I said? I said, you need to go over there and stand by the elevator. And by that time the uncle got out, I said, he's hard-headed. Now, I grew up in a community where everybody could chastise you, you know, and it would have gotten back to my mother before I got home that I had done that. But, you know, we have a lot of kids who are raising themselves. I see parents who don't want to be parents, who don't know how to be parents. They weren't parented correctly. And so how do you know how to do it? When we do child death review, literally everybody is sitting around the table. There's somebody there from juvenile court. There's somebody there from several people from the Department of Children and Family Services, somebody there from WIC. Somebody's there from Help Me Grow. All the intervention services, and they publish the names that we're going to go do, and then we go around, and any information you have, we bring it forth. I can tell you when I could have told you that when this little boy was 2 years old, and his mother's boyfriend was sexually molesting him, and then he was in 3 different foster homes, that he's going to be dead in the street by the time he's 15 years old. That's what's going to happen. If he doesn't, he'd be very lucky to get out of that. You can't go into the military anymore. When I was in high school, if you got in a little trouble, the judge would say, do you want to go to jail or do you want to go to the Army? And so for a lot of people, the Army was the structure that they needed so that they got those 3 meals a day, they had structure, and they knew what they needed to do. You can't do that anymore. You don't have a high school diploma, you have a record, the military doesn't want you. So where do we take you and rehab you to put you back out into the community? The other thing we know is, and there's something called the Comer School Model. James Comer was a black child psychiatrist, and he and Alvin Poussaint published a lot together, and he was one of my mentors when I did my fellowship. And Dr. Comer had Comer School in New Haven, because he said, it's not, why would you take kids and, quote, suspend them and put them out of the building? You know, then they're outside making fun of the kids who are in the building. Or they're outside and they're not getting that breakfast and they're not getting that lunch, and they're being disruptive. So the Comer model is you don't do out-of-school suspensions. You go to a different part of the school, but that's where your suspension is, and they try to work on seeing what your problems are. But part of it is we don't want to spend the money for that. We, realize that our president was sent to a military boarding school because he was a disruptive teenager. He was an unruly teenager, and that's why they sent him to New York Military Academy. Well, his parents had the money to do that, but everybody doesn't have the money to do that. So we've got to think about what do we do early on to intervene with kids so that, and I don't know that that was the best thing for him, but they wanted him out of the house. Obviously, they wanted him out of the house. I'd like him out of that big White House too right now. But we have models. We know things that work, and we don't either have the political will to do them, or we don't want to spend the money to do them. And usually it's both. And it's not that we need more models. We've got them. We just have to decide that we want to have them work here in Cleveland and in the Cleveland community.
Make the commitment
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
Let me, we've got about 15, 20 minutes, and we've got some really good questions up here, and I want to get to as many as I can. So I'm going to ask these questions, and I want each of you go ahead and weigh in, but just real briefly. So there's kind of a lightning round, okay, on some of these things, okay? What is the role of the faith community in addressing gun violence? How important is it?
Well, the faith community is fading out. I mean, a lot of churches are struggling to just keep membership. As I said, a lot of the patients that I see are unchurched. They don't go. They don't go to church. They're not connected with a church. And the churches that are in the inner city tend to be smaller and don't have the budgets to do the kind of things that we would all like to see them do. So the role of the faith community, I think people in the faith community have to decide what they're going to do. But I think it's very difficult because so many people are just not even connected. But I think if you're feeding somebody a lunch, they don't really care what your denomination is. I mean, I was just in Sarasota, and we were at my cousin's church doing a breakfast for the homeless on Saturday morning. This is a predominantly black, kind of Pentecostal-based church. 80% of the people that we served were white, because the homeless in Sarasota tend to be a lot of old white guys. And, well, I mean, it's like anywhere else. They come because it's warm. You know, I mean, you can live on the street if the weather is okay. And some of them clearly, to me, had some mental health issues. But, I mean, they're doing that, and they're not doing it for their own members. They're doing it for the people that are out there in the community. But people have to decide they want to do that.
Right. Here's an interesting question. Does being involved in the arts, music, and they mentioned classical music here, have a deterrent on young people to avoid guns? And maybe go beyond just the arts, but are there certain types of pursuits that can...
If I may.
Sure.
Thank you. In the listening tour, so many kids said that they wished that they could have an opportunity to showcase their talents. And we heard everything from, I'm an amazing chef, I love to dance, I'm a great rapper, I'm a poet, and actually sometimes, you know, these kids would actually share with us. So they would love an opportunity to do something because they feel that their time is definitely, well, idle time is the devil's playground. They feel like they've got nothing to do, but they would love an opportunity to showcase their skills. That would mean so much to kids.
Totally agree with that. Cleveland Public Theater has done several partnerships with us at CMHA and with the police department to a very, very positive end. Just a quick example, there was a mural that was being designed and drawn in one of our family estates, and I was brought in because there was a concern about vandalism to that mural. I was also concerned about vandalism to the mural, but when Cleveland Public Theater engaged the kids in the neighborhood, and adults, big kids and little kids, we did not have one incident of vandalism. And I would say that we didn't have any incidences of violence along that corridor there simply because of that mural there. So arts, I think that's an untapped resource that we can certainly use as a diversion to keep our young people and, in a lot of cases, older people busy towards something positive.
I want to speak to that too.
Yes.
And I was trying to figure out how to work this in, so this is perfect. So, I mean, first of all, again, there's a lot of good research that shows about the effect of the arts on the developing brain. It's perfect, it's helpful. It actually can impede instances, proclivity to violence, so that's really good. But there's this wonderful line of research that's been out there for a long time. It talks about, so I think this relates back to Dr. McDavid's anti-fragility initiative. So I'm used to calling this resilience, right, where we build in what kids need to resist whatever it is. And this research says that what the really determinative thing about how a kid is going to go on to develop is whether they are recognized as being good at something, uniquely good at something, by their family and their peers by the time they're 10. And often, if you think about the things that kids are good at in early ages, often it's the arts. It could also be sports. But those are a couple of things that, where they often will have great success. And the protective factor of that recognition is just huge. So, I live in Cleveland Heights, and I know that for many, many years, and I think it's still true, in 4th grade, every kid gets an instrument. And they have instruction, and, I'm just excited that that's been able to continue. It's so important, not only from a research standpoint, but, you see it in people's lives, the difference that it makes.
So it's basically the outlets that can give kids self-worth at a very early age so that they learn early on that there's a way to feel good about themselves, to have a power over their lives that doesn't involve being a tough guy or girl on the street.
Yeah, so an initiative that I've been associated with, I do work at the Cleveland Clinic on grants, and they have, an institute, I don't know what it's called, does anybody know? It's for arts and healing and stuff like that, and it's all this wonderful stuff. But they have a partnership through their community outreach group with Karamu House. And I was actually privileged to experience one of these projects where Karamu House will come in and work with a classroom. I think they target 2nd grade in the CMSD, and develop. It's just wonderful. Like in our project, we addressed bullying, which is certainly something that is around all this stuff. And so Karamu would take the kids' words, would help them write a play, and over 8 weeks, they would work on producing the play, and then we got to go see the end product, and it was marvelous. And so, those kinds of experiences are really powerful for kids.
Okay. Now here's a question too, and I don't know much about this, but I'm assuming this has happened here in town. Do gun buyback programs really work? 2018, it says here 185 guns collected in exchange for gift cards. I'm assuming is that something that's worth pursuing more?
The kids in jail tell me that they think that they're a joke. I know that they are done occasionally. They often feel that there's a setup, or that they could go and wind up getting arrested for something, that it's some sort of a sting operation. That's just what they say.
Well, and then other people position themselves on the fringe and offer to buy the gun,
Oh, right, and then they get it for
Yeah.
50.
Oh, really? So you have like a straw purchaser and all that kind of thing. So how easy is it to get a gun? Pretty easy, huh? What's a typical, not that I want to give anybody any ideas, but if I wanted to walk out of here tonight and get a gun, where would I go? What would I do? Who would I talk to?
A gun shop.
It's open.
Yeah, it's open. A gun shop.
So a gun shop can, and again, I know we're not getting into laws, but a gun shop will sell to anybody, pretty much. They do ask you about some things, right?
When I ask
Chief?
somebody where they got a gun, I'm sorry, they
No, go
always
ahead,
get very,
Judge. You-
very
you-
nervous.
yeah.
Why are you, they don't want to answer me because they think that, but they just, when I ask somebody in my courtroom, when did you get how long did it take you to get a gun? I don't know, like a couple hours, but it's always the same $2 to $250, and they can get one right away.
If you want a really good gun, you're going to have to pay a lot more than that at a gun dealer. But if you're buying it on the street, you can probably get it for a third to a half of what it would cost you. But you see the gun shops get broken into. People steal from the gun shop.
And is that, Chief, is that where most people get their guns? They get them through illegal means?
I would say the guns that are on the streets are through illegal means. And she's right. The gun shops, we've been monitoring this now for about a year. There's been a growing trend of these gun shops, suburban gun shops getting broken into and those firearms being recovered in the inner city, more specifically being recovered in my backyard. So I'm very concerned about that.
And are gun dealers, how reputable are the gun dealers? I know you have the gun shows, people complain about things going on. I don't know what the facts are, but for the most part, do gun dealers make an effort to not sell a gun to somebody that they think maybe has bad intent, or do they just not really care? Any of you?
Does the liquor store not sell liquor to alcoholics?
Thank you. Okay.
There are programs, though, for gun dealers, training programs, to help them if they're interested, to help them identify who might be a higher risk. And through the Suicide Prevention Foundation, we contacted a bunch of gun dealers in Ohio, and they were reasonably interested, and many people took up the training. So, you know, I have to say I was actually pleasantly surprised that there was more interest in that than I thought there might be.
We really should outlaw high-velocity assault weapons, because there's no reason to have one. If you're not in the military, there's no reason to have one. I told you I come from a family of hunters. Hunters eat what they kill. I mean, you know, now you couldn't bring a deer home because my mother wasn't going to have that, but you could bring home quail and pheasant. But you were going, we would eat it. And people who live in rural areas who hunt, they eat what they kill, you know. So you have no reason, you don't hunt with a high velocity rifle. That's not what you want. You want to be able to share whatever it is with your family and your community if that's what you choose to do. So I think we need to outlaw high velocity assault style weapons because there's no reason to have one.
And I think that came up at one of our previous forums, but that's good luck, right, in the state of Ohio?
And a lot of other states.
Well, in a lot of other states, that's true. Should gun violence be treated as a public health issue?
Yes.
And if so, what does that mean? What does that mean, and what does that involve?
Well, for me, it means that law enforcement has failed. And typically, it's always been the responsibility when you look backwards of who's responsible for gun violence or any type of violence, and it's usually the cops. Cops are called, we respond, and unfortunately, our method of handling that violent incident was by removing the perpetrator and not paying attention to the impact that violence had on the family. So in more ways than one, law enforcement was not trained. We did not have the training. We were not properly equipped for dealing with the traumatic effect of violence, especially violence in the home. So very much true that we have to, as a society, we got to deal with violence as a public health issue. Simply, there has to be a triage. There has to be an examination of the symptoms. There has to be a deep down drill through as to the causes, and I think that that's where public health, the public health model will be very, very effective at addressing violence.
Mm-hmm. Here's an interesting question. Will smart guns ever catch on? And does that pose a whole nother level of concern?
What's a smart gun?
I believe a smart gun, if I'm not, is the 3D, what do you call it? Right, the print guns. Oh, the fingerprints, so as a safety mechanism.
Only the owner.
For the owner,
Right.
okay. Then this goes to trying to keep,
Children and stolen.
yeah. So I guess if somebody gets a hold of a gun that's stolen, and it can't use it, right, because only the person whose fingerprints are in it. Does that make sense?
Well, a group of people went to Europe. They went to the gun manufacturers and said, "You're selling smart guns in Europe. Why don't you sell them?"
You know, if I could just, I remember this coming up a while back, and when I was on the editorial board at the Plain Dealer, and one of the editorial writers weighed in on this who was pro-gun, and he was saying that part of the reason why this may have difficulty catching on is that if, say the technology doesn't work, and you know, I know how many times I try to, you know, use my thumb on my cell phone, right, to get it to turn on, and I got it, and you know, I'm guessing that a lot of people are concerned that they have that gun, they feel they need it for protection to shoot, and it's like, oh, doggone it, they're not reading my fingerprint. Is that part of the problem here? Is that, no?
No, it's that the gun manufacturers won't make them in this
They're
country.
Oh, they
making
won't.
them, they don't,
They won't sell them.
yeah, the gun dealers here don't want to pay the extra money.
What percentage,
Loretta, they spoke to Block, they spoke
Yeah.
to whoever would speak to them. It was Greater Cleveland congregations who belonged to their umbrella organization, and they went over to Europe.
interesting.
Yeah, but in the rest of the world, I mean,
Right.
gun ownership is not
It's not
nowhere
an
like
issue.
it is here.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
it just, you know, we have enough guns for every man, woman, and child.
And part of the argument
Right.
was, we are police, we buy guns, do you want our business? And start making smart guns, we asked for two things, and don't sell to straw purchasers. And they didn't get very far.
I mean, is there any, I know this gets in the political question, but without the legal answers, without putting restrictions on guns, without doing some of the things that they do in like some of the European countries and well, countries all over the world where they don't have near the gun violence we have, I mean, is there really any hope for us? I mean, unless we can create a society where everybody has a caring family and plenty of money and opportunity and no reason to get down or discouraged or feel hopeless. You know, if we can't develop a society like that, we're always going to have conflict, right? We're always going to have envy. We're always going to have anger. And if we have guns in the mix, we're always going to have, am I right? I mean,
No.
No? Okay.
Because, okay, so there are these wonderful graphs that have been done about, you know, tons of countries, like 45 countries, right? Only maybe 10 of which are Western industrialized countries. You know, so we're talking about like countries like Colombia and Peru, and I don't know exactly if that's the right example, but they have fewer guns than we have, and they have fewer gun deaths than we have, by factors of like 30. I mean, it's just astonishing what the differences are. And I mean, if you were talking only about like Scandinavian countries, well, okay, then they have less poverty and they have better social systems and that kind of thing. But not all of these countries do. I mean, the inescapable conclusion is that the biggest problem with gun violence is the guns. And until we separate some of the people who have impulses to do violence from the guns, we're still going to have it as long as we have these millions of guns that we have. The thing that I think might be hopeful, and I think we should look to this, and I see all you wonderful moms people, and I love you so much because I know you do such wonderful work in all these rooms where people want to hold hearings at midnight and kick you out and all this kind of stuff, and thank you so much for all of your efforts. But the thing that I think might be hopeful is like understanding and training. You know, the Japanese model, I think, is the wonderful one. You know, in Japan, I can't say all of it, but it's like this 10-step process if you want to have a gun. And you have to pass a written test, even to apply for the gun. And the reason for having the gun can't be for self-protection. It has to be for some other kind of reason. And then after you've been approved for the gun, there's a 6-month waiting period, and I'm making up some of these time frames, but it's something like that. And then you have to go through a 6-month training period, and then you have to pass a proficiency test, and then you have to get relicensed every year or something like that. And it's like, I mean, I know that that's not anywhere near where we are, but it's something to appeal to because, you know, being optimistic, as you said, my optimism comes from the fact that, I mean, I've spent my life helping people change. And I know to my bones that people can change. People can change at system levels, and people can change at individual levels, in families and as really little children and every place in between. And I know that if we have a collective will to do better and, not to see our children dying in the numbers that they're dying because of rampant access to guns, which happens in no other society but ours. Right. That we can do it. We just have to really get behind the doing of it. And
I think you cringed when I made my statement, but I think that's what I was trying to say. That
Okay.
if we can't solve our social ills, and we overlay incredible easy access to guns, we're gonna have these issues. I guess is what I'm saying. Right. Absolutely. Last word, Chief. I'm going to give to you. The most important thing to getting through to kids or or adults who feel that urge to pick up a gun or to use a gun in conflict, most important way that we can try to reduce that amount of people going in that direction.
I believe that education is the key. If we can educate these kids that there is an alternative to fighting, that there is an alternative to escalating to serious violence, and that there is a way of resolving a conflict without necessarily having a gun. I really believe that that's the secret. The other part of the secret is that we've got to pay a lot of attention to this notion of bullying, because research has indicated, and I'm not PhD, so please, but I've read and I've got enough friends that have told me that more often than not, the kid that resorts to gun violence is because, in some cases, most cases, they've been bullied. They feel powerless. They don't have any other alternative other than they need a sense of control. They need a sense to feel like they're in charge, and they need a way to demonstrate to somebody else that, look, you're not going to mess with me any longer. And in order for me to show you that I am your equal, or at least in their minds, then that's where the gun gets introduced. But I do say that addressing guns is a very critical, that's a very unrestricted area that we've really got to come up with an answer for how we're going to place tighter regulations on. I still remain that the violence is learned, and we've got to unteach what is currently going on right now that is leading up to violence, because we can talk about guns all we want. The truth is, nothing is going to be done right away. There is no quick fix to getting rid of guns in our community. But I think that if we focus on educating, teaching young kids that violence is because of this, they're going to fight. But if we teach them that, there's a big difference between a fight or an argument and now escalating to a violent situation where you got to go out and get a knife. A knife also sometimes, but a gun. If we can teach the kid alternatives, divert them from that path, then I think we'll be on a path to success in reducing gun violence in our community.
Get them excited about life.
Themselves.
Yeah, and
self-esteem.
Themselves. Yep. Dr. Jane Timmons-Mitchell, Judge Synenberg, Dr. McDavid, Chief González, thank you very much for participating, and thank you all for showing up. Good night.